Jew. Who is a Jew? That's the very same question that Paul is asking his readers in Romans 3, which is what I'm going to talk about this morning. So let me read this to you. You can follow along if you wish on page 1608 of the Complete Jewish Study Bible. It's not in the Complete Jewish Bible. In traditional Judaism, one is either a Jew by birth or by choice. For a Jew by birth, there are two basic positions: matrilineal, that is a person who is Jewish if born from a Jewish mother, and patrilineal, born of a Jewish father. Orthodox and conservative Judaism hold to a matrilineal position, meaning being born of a Jewish mother. In Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism, a bilineal approach is used, acknowledging both matrilineal and patrilineal descent, either by a mother or a father. A Jew by choice is a person not born a Jew who freely chooses to become a Jew through conversion, also known as a proselyte. This person is considered in Hebrew a ger, or a convert. Generally, all of Judaism traces its origin to Abraham, who was called a Hebrew, his son Yitzhak, and grandson Yaakov as well. The etymology of the word Jew goes back to the word Yehuda, or Judah, one of the 12 sons of Yaakov, or the 12 tribes of Israel. The root Hebrew meaning of the word Jew, Yehudi, means to praise. The term Jew came to mean anyone from the tribe of Yehuda, Judah. Eventually, it was extended to refer to all Israelites of all the tribes, not just the descendants of Judah. That was because Judah became the most influential tribe back in the day. But what about Romans 2:28-29, which we just read last week? Was Shaul Paul redefining the term Jew only spiritually and thereby rejecting the physical? That's what it seems to say. Or, on the surface it seems so, but when the text is considered with other related verses, it's clear that his purpose was to remind those who were Jews not to rely only upon the physical signs of circumcision, their Jewishness, to be justified before God, but to rely upon the circumcision of the heart that leads to true praise. I think that's an important note to read as we begin to take a look at Romans chapter 3, and we answer the question, does it matter? Does being Jewish matter at all? The reason I chose Galatians to teach on a few months ago was because our congregation is made up of a mixture of Jews and non-Jews. And the Galatians were very similar to that, in that they were a mixture of mostly Gentiles who had come to faith in the Messiah, and Jewish people as well who were born again believers at that time as well. So I thought it would be important for us to study the book of Galatians to get the right perspective, especially since in the Messianic Jewish world, there's a problem, in my opinion, where many Gentiles feel that they must become Jewish to get extra blessings. But I'm going to challenge that. I think a person does get great blessings by participating in Jewish life, but a Gentile does not have to be a proselyte and go through physical circumcision to receive many of these blessings. Unfortunately, in the Messianic world, too often you see Gentiles who adopt all the Jewish ways, and not just some, all of them, and I call them super Jews, because they seem to just be more Jewish than all the other Jewish people I know. They overdo it like most converts do. It's not a terrible thing, it's just something I think needs to be noted. So when we read these words from the Complete Jewish Bible on what is a Jew, the big question is, does being Jewish matter? And for our congregation, we need to answer this question. Verse 3 of Romans 3 says, then what advantage has the Jew? That's verse 1 of chapter 3. Then what advantage or benefit or profit or use has the Jew? He has to ask this question because he has just, in the previous chapter, mentioned about the fact that it didn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, particularly in terms of salvation. So he goes down and asks a question. It's a rhetorical question. He's not writing to anybody in particular. He's not writing to a letter to have a discussion. He's kind of writing a general letter to a fictitious person or a fictitious group. But what advantage, he says, has the Jew? What value is there being circumcised? Now he's going to return to this issue when we get to chapter 9. But for now, he says, much in every way. So even though he says that it didn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile in terms of salvation, circumcision, that is, being Jewish, does matter much in every way. A strong statement. And he goes on, in the first place, the Jews were entrusted, now that's a key word, not just given possession of, but given responsibility for the Torah, the very words of God. So when we lift up the Torah, and thank you, Carrie, that you got here in time to lift it. I'm sure you rushed. I hope you didn't violate the law of Maryland to get here, but you did get here on time. I was glad. I knew you were in a traffic jam. And we have a good backup in case you didn't get there, Joseph. But when we lift up the Torah and we affirm it and we say prayers before and after we read it, there's a reason for that, because the Torah was given by God to our ancestors, and it's a precious document. It's a precious document more than we even know. We just learned a little bit about the laws of a daughter that's sold into bondage because her father is poor, and how God, through the Torah, explained how that should be handled. There are so many teachings in the Torah that if even in our country, the United States of America, would be followed, we would have a much better world. The Torah is fair, it's loving, it's teaching. And by the way, the Torah, the word Torah, I would prefer not using the word law, because it sounds like law, but instruction, because the Torah is an instruction book for how to live. And the root word for Torah is the same word as instruction. So let's look at the law or of the Torah more as instruction than rules and regulations. So he says, much in every way, because the Jews were entrusted, given not just possession, but responsibility to look after, but with the very words, and the Revised Standard Version uses the word oracles there instead of words, oracles of God. Now, oracles in those days were words that were given by mystics and prophets and so forth. They were not just words, they were messages from the spiritual world. So the Revised Standard Version uses the word oracles there. Even though we're going to see one specific way it doesn't matter, we're also going to see that being Jewish really does matter. And let's look at this. Back in Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, Israel is referred to as the fewest of all the peoples. Sometimes it says, some translations say it's the smallest of all the peoples. And I've never known whether it means short or few in number. I think that most Jewish people tend to be short, although there's an occasional exception to the rule. But I think really it means is that the Jewish people were chosen, even though they were the smallest group of people on the earth. But God was going to use his spiritual force in the world to make of the Jewish people a very important nation. And let's face it, like many philosophers and historians have figured out, the Jews, even though a small percentage of the world population, have an amazing influence. Did you know that the Jewish world population is 0.004%? Not 4%, 1/100 of 4%. That's hardly anything. There's only about 12 or 13 million Jews in the whole world, compared to what, 5, 6 billion people? Yet look what God does just through the Jewish people. It doesn't mean that we're better. It means that God chose the Jewish people to bring amazing blessings to the entire world. I know all of you love to wear your jeans, your Levi's. Thank a Jew, Levi Strauss, for them. Doesn't everybody like to wear, what did they call them in the old days? My mother used to call them dungarees. Anybody heard that archaic term, dungarees? You old timers. Now they're called Levi's or jeans. Anyway, God promised to bless the world through the Jewish people, and that's promised in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and other verses. Why did he do that? Because God figured, I'll find an agency through which to bring my message of God's teaching and God's instruction through a group of people. So the importance of being one of the chosen people is that we are set apart. The word in Hebrew is segulah. The word in Hebrew, segulah, means a unique treasure. A unique treasure. That's what segulah means. So God said, I'm going to call the Jewish people to be my unique treasure. So let's look at what this means in human terms. I was thinking about this. How do I take this kind of ethereal construct and bring it down to our terms today? Let's say our parents paved the way for us, somehow making things go more smoothly for us. Sometimes people get great jobs because employers know our parents and perhaps want to do something for their children because they love them. Or some people get breaks when they apply to colleges because their parents are alumni of the school. They're called legacies, as if their parents left a legacy for them. Our patriarchs left a legacy for their descendants. So what I mean here is that your parents can help you by what they do in their life that took place before you. My grandparents got on a boat in Europe when they left the former Soviet Union, Russia, and they went into the lowest cabin called steerage because they didn't have enough money to travel in any higher class, but they left Russia to escape the pogroms, and they came to the New World, that is the United States of America. My grandparents lived in poverty. They came to the Lower East Side of New York City. They lived in a cold water walk-up flat. My poor grandmother used to have to walk up 4 to 6 flights of stairs with her groceries. No elevators, cold water. But they did that. They left the old world to come to the new world for the sake of their family and their future descendants. They paved the way. They paved the way. There's something wonderful about that. Our ancestors have earned and done a lot of things that we don't recognize that have imputed blessing to us. Let's face it, in the United States we have more opportunity than any place in the world. We didn't do that. Maybe our grandparents did. Maybe our parents did. We have to remember to be grateful for what God has done in our lives. We have blessing from God only because of what our ancestors did, that is the Jewish people, not because of what we did. Salvation is like that. It's God's doing, not ours. I promise you, I did not choose to be a Jew. I had nothing to do with it. In fact, when I was 8 days old, I wish I hadn't been. If you catch my drift. But God chose the Jewish people because through the Jewish people he expected to bless the rest of the world. So if we, Jews, and then in a parallel way, believers who have become followers of the Messiah, were chosen from the foundation of the universe, if God knew each one of us in our mother's wombs, which speaks to the recent laws about the infanticide of even born children. You realize that there are laws being passed in Virginia and New York that a child can be left to die after birth, after he is, or she is born. I think it's a very horrible thing that we're hearing about, and we must be aware and we must fight this, because it's the kind of thing that happened in Nazi Germany. If a child wasn't healthy enough, he was left to die. Back in the Roman days, they would leave a child out in the wilderness to die if he was not a perfect-looking Roman specimen. Apparently, this has happened before in history, and may our country, the United States of America, never go down that path. But we have to be cognizant, aware, and fight this if it comes up to our attention. Nowadays, there's laws being passed that say if you don't think your child is beautiful enough, or you don't like your child, or the the child might be born deformed, you can let it die. Just across the Potomac River in Virginia, they're talking about that. Anyway, God chose us solely by his decision. Our challenge, like the Jewish people Paul is addressing, is what are we going to do with this great gift? How important to us is God's choosing us? I'm speaking primarily to the Jewish people in our congregation. Typically, today, most of us Jews don't really think that much about our identities. To many, it's no big deal. To others, it's almost embarrassing to be chosen. We know we're the chosen people, but we don't know what we were chosen for. So it's kind of a challenge to us to be identifying as Jews. Many Jewish people have been persecuted because the world knows we're chosen, and they persecute us because they're jealous. This is a fact of history, friends. And to other Jewish people, it's too much responsibility to carry, and so we kind of diminish the importance of being a Jew. So many Jews today don't grasp the answer Paul gave to his rhetorical question about, does it matter to be Jewish? Much in every way. To my Messianic Jewish brothers and sisters here, we need to step into our calling. And to my Messianic Gentile brothers and sisters, I ask you to help us Jews assume the roles and responsibility God had and has for us today. You that are not Jewish play a critical role in helping us Jews fulfill our unique calling, and I hope you see this. You may have said many times, what am I doing in a Messianic Jewish congregation? I would challenge you that one of the things you are doing here is to help us Jews fulfill our responsibility. I hope you don't join Emmanuel just to learn things about the Torah and the Jewish way of life that you haven't learned in previous congregations. I hope you participate in Emmanuel to help Emmanuel fulfill its calling. I hope you join Emmanuel to help your Jewish brothers and sisters fulfill our calling to the nations. You remember the teaching in the prophets that in the last days 10 Gentiles will hold on to the fringes of a Jew and say, teach us the ways of your God? That is important, and that is good. That's our calling. So you that are not Jewish, realize that you have a very important role in this, and that's to help the Jewish people fulfill our calling because it relates to the future salvation of the entire world. So often we Jews don't step up. Often we Jews step aside. That's got to stop. Verse 3, if some of them were unfaithful, Paul writes, so what? Does their faithlessness cancel God's faithfulness? Heaven forbid, me benito. God would be true even if everyone were a liar. So he's saying a lot of the Jewish people back in the day did not fulfill their responsibilities as Jews. So Paul, again, is asking rhetorically, so what? Does it matter? And he said, it does matter, but God is faithful even though some of us Jews have been faithless. Heaven forbid God would be true even if everyone else was a liar, as the Tanakh says, so that you, God, may be proved right in your words and win the verdict when you are put on trial. That was verse 4 of Romans 3. Here Paul reinforces that even though some or even all, which is not the case, of our ancestors were unfaithful, does not mean that God won't be faithful to us. He knew all about us when he chose us from the foundation of the earth. He knew about our failures. He knew about our frailties. He knew about our fickleness. Even before he chose us. Yet he did indeed choose the Jewish people for a purpose. And we that are not, and you that are not Jewish but are part of the Messianic world, you were chosen also for a purpose, whether you know it or not, to help us Jews fulfill our role as well as the role that God has given you. It goes on in verse 5 saying, now if our unrighteousness, he's speaking of the Jewish people, if our unrighteousness highlights God's righteousness, what should we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict his anger on us? Quote, in parentheses, I am speaking here the way people commonly do. Paul is kind of making a comment about his comment. Heaven forbid, else how could God judge the world? So he's saying, It wouldn't be fair if he didn't also judge his own people and let them off the hook. No, you say, if through my life God's truth is enhanced and brings him greater glory, why am I still judged merely for being a sinner? Indeed, why not say, as some people slander us, claiming we do, this is Paul's notes, let us do evil so that so good may come of it. Against them the judgment is a just one. Apparently, there were people who had a perverse understanding of this, of God's forgiveness. Many thinking that Paul was proud to preach that he was a forgiven sinner, and by doing so increased the effectiveness of his ministry, making it seem greater and greater. Now, have you ever heard people give a testimony? How many of you heard a testimony? It's not something that every congregation does. It's where a person shares about their experiences, what they were like before they became believers, and how they became believers, and so forth. It's called a testimony. And I'd like us to start sharing some testimonies down the road here. I think it's edifying to us. But if you ever heard a testimony, sometimes the description of the way a person was before they were believers is even worse than they were. It sounds like they must have been, one step above an axe murder, because they want to emphasize the love of God. So these things are exaggerated so much. And we have to be careful with that, because we don't need to exaggerate God's work in our lives. I was not a terrible person. I practiced transcendental meditation and was studying to be a teacher of it before I became a believer. So God rescued me from a rather foreign Eastern religion that is not biblical. So when I share my testimony, I will sometimes go into the details of what it means to be a transcendental meditator, just to paint the picture. But sometimes testimonies are exaggerated, where somebody doesn't even have bad news in the past, but makes it bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is what the issue was here in Paul's day, because people were accusing Paul, apparently, of exaggerating his bad behavior to show the grace of God. So verse 9 he says, so are we Jews better off? Not entirely. For I have already made the charge that all people, Jews and Gentiles alike, are controlled by sin. As the Tanakh puts it, now we have a list of verses that Paul put together mostly from the Psalms. There is none righteous, no, not even one. No one understands, no one seeks God. All have turned away, and at the same time become useless. There is no one who shows kindness, not a single one. Their throats are open graves. They use their tongues to deceive. Vipers' venom is under their lips. Their mouths are full of curses and bitterness. Their feet rush to shed blood. In their ways to ruin and misery, and the way of peace they do not even know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. What a list of charges that Paul puts together, mostly from the Psalms, to basically describe the way humanity is. Jews and Gentiles are like this. The series of appeals from the Tanakh points out the depravity of men. Scholar Craig Keener states this: Paul is piling up texts, mostly from the Psalms, about the common sinfulness of humanity. Just as Jewish midrash regularly link texts together based on a common key word or concept, Paul links all these texts together and basically concludes that we're all in pretty big trouble. Would you agree? Now, I haven't seen anybody in this congregation behave like this described. Because we're thousands of years past it. We've all gotten civilized. But the truth is, in our hearts, there is no good thing. That's an exaggeration, because in our hearts there are some good things. But when Paul writes, he's writing in the extremes. So he would say, in our hearts there is no good thing. Paul points out when it comes to sin, we're all in a sinking boat together, Jews and Gentiles. Even though God clearly chose the Jewish people to be his covenant people. You remember what James wrote, Jacob and the new covenant? For we all stumble in many ways. And 1 John says, if we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. So if you were thinking to yourself when you listened to that list, hey, that doesn't pertain to me, I don't sin. Folks, according to John, in 1 John, that would be calling God a liar, and we're deceiving ourselves. We all sin. It's part of our nature. We have to remember that. Here at the beginning of Romans, the great apostle starts off in chapter 1, as I shared with you, that Gentiles commit sins. We got that. And in chapter 2, that Jewish people also commit sins. We got that. So here in chapter 3, he pulls us together and states that all humanity needs help. And I've come up with little stories, the pictures, I think, what might have happened back in those days. There's a tradition that God offered the Torah to the different peoples on the earth. So I expanded it. God offered the Torah to the Romans, but they didn't want to give up their homosexuality and idolatry, so they declined. Next, he offered the Torah to the Hindus, but they preferred staring at their navels and reading God's Word, so they too declined. Then he offered the Torah to the Buddhists, but they preferred smelling incense rather than offering prayers of sweet incense unto the Lord, so they too said no. So he offered it to the Jewish people, and they said, we'll take the whole package. As they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, all that the Lord said, we will do. However, as Paul points out, our people did not get there. We fell exceedingly short, just like the Gentiles did, so the Torah taught them that. Moreover, we know that whatever the Torah says, it says it to those living within the framework of the Torah, in order that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world be shown to deserve God's judgment. For in his sight, no one alive is considered righteous, on the ground of legalistic observance of Torah commands, because what Torah really does is show people how sinful they are. Let me unpack that verse. The expression legalistic observance of Torah commands is a reference to the traditions of the elders, which became known as the Talmud, the traditions. It's not the Torah, it's not the written word of God, it's some of the distortions of the Torah that had developed in Judaism at that day. And Yeshua actually confronts some of those misinterpretations, and I'm writing about that in response to one of the letters that was circulating in our congregation. I'll finish that probably this week. Clearly, one of the purposes of Torah is to show people, particularly the Jewish people in this sense, that they are in a desperate situation. Our people promised God, but didn't follow through. We made a promise to God, a covenant with God, and we didn't follow through. Instead, many preferred to practice the traditions of the elders, which they did well, but their hearts were not turned to God. And Yeshua accused some of the leaders, and perhaps even most of our people, to some extent, even us. Woe to you hypocritical Torah teachers and Parishim, Pharisees. You pay your tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, mercy, trust. These are the things you should have attended to without neglecting the others. You see, they were very good at following certain practices, certain easy practices, not unlike the religions of their day. It was easy to tithe mint, dill, and cumin. This was not expensive stuff. And all they had to do was take their tithes of that and present them to the temple. But what Yeshua is saying is that there's a deeper aspect to the Torah. Yes, the Torah does require that we give our tithes of mint, cumin, and spices, dill, but the Torah has a lot more issues for us to consider. They were focusing on the minors, not on the majors. They were good at certain practices, but they were missing the bigger stuff of life. And let me just mention, sometimes it's easier to do a good thing, but not the right thing. That was a continual problem in ancient Israel, and I suggest it's a problem for us today. You remember the story of what's called in some Bibles the rich young ruler? He was not a ruler, but he was a leader of the people, and he was wealthy. So Yeshua comes, and one of the leaders comes to Yeshua and says, "Good Rabbi, what should I do to obtain eternal life?" Yeshua said to him, "Why are you calling me good? No one is good but God. You know the mitzvot. Don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't give false testimony, honor your father, your mother, etc., etc. And he replied, I have kept those things since I was a boy. You know this parable, right? On hearing this, Yeshua said to him, there's still one thing you lack. Sell whatever you have. Distribute the proceeds to the poor, and you will have riches in heaven. Then come and follow me. But when the man heard this, he became very sad. Why? He was very rich. He appeared to be righteous, but his heart was far away from his Father in this one area, and Messiah was able to see it. We are not dissimilar. We tend to do what we like to do, that which we find easy, but avoid that which is difficult. I have seen people in our congregation manage to not do the difficult, but do a great job with the easy. Years ago, actually it was many years ago, Steve will remember, when we met at the Baptist church on Route 104. I forgot the name of it. They had a kitchen there, a nice big kitchen. And it seemed like during the service, when I'm giving my message, a lot of the women would get up and disappear. Usually when I began my message, which is kind of rough for a preacher, you know. You start your message and a bunch of women get up and leave. I never understood it. But they would go into the kitchen and prepare the foods. Sometimes they would bring food with them and make it there. And they would miss the message. Later on, a lot of these women left the congregation. And I finally found out what it was that was troubling them. They said, well, we just never get spiritual food. Of course they didn't get spiritual food. They were in the kitchen. They were not listening to the Word of God. They were doing a good thing, and they made wonderful food for the congregation. But for them, they were not doing a wrong thing. They needed to hear the Word of God. And as a result, they walked away from our congregation. We don't let that happen anymore. If women are in the kitchen or men in the kitchen cooking, we try to avoid that so that the people can be part of the congregation and hear the Word of God. Yeshua was quite clear about people doing what they needed to do to grow. The rich leader needed to give away all of his wealth because money can be the root of all evil if it controls a person. And since we all know about this, we all know how important money is to us, we all should be challenged to remember that the concept of tithing is a biblical concept. That is so difficult. One Christian preacher said the last thing to get converted is the pocketbook. It's very difficult to give our money away, isn't it? Especially when times are tough. But if we learn how to give money away when times are tough, it makes it easier to give money away when times are good. But if we just avoid it altogether, we never grow, we never mature. I admit that it's hard for me to give money away. Okay, I've worked hard for many, many years, and I have 2 jobs, so I have some money. And I knew that this was going to be a problem for me. So what I did, I set up my bank account to automatically send a tithe to Emmanuel every month. Yeah, when I see my checkbook and I see that a check has amount of money has left my bank and gone to Emmanuel's bank, I get a little pinch. I think that's a lot of money. But then I think, I'm only doing what the Lord said to do. I just needed some help to do it. So I like this automatic payment that you can use, set up your checking account to do. Does anybody know about automatic payments? And that has worked well for me, and I'm glad to do it. And I have found that the Lord has blessed me in many ways, not just financially, but in many ways as well. Look at, I have a wonderful, lovely wife, Lisa. Some of you know her. She's back there doing something, reading the Bible, I think. And I've been blessed in many ways, and I just want to pass that on to you as a hint. If you have trouble tithing, and most people do, consider setting up a system on your bank account, your checking account, for automatic payments. Typically tithe, which is a King James word for tenth, tithe means tenth in King James language. And the first English Bibles were written by scholars in the days of good old King James. And so that's why we use a lot of this archaic language like tithe. Nobody talks about tithes except people are reading the King James Version. But it means 10%. And so if you have a job that is consistent, you can set it to be 10% of that. Or if your money is flexible, you can adjust it each time and maybe just give 10% of what comes in. But it's a principle that I think a lot of us have trouble dealing with. And this is the problem that the rich ruler had, the rich elder, because he couldn't follow the Torah the way God needed him to follow the Torah. He did a lot of good things, but he did not do the right thing. Think about it. Think about it. We want to do the right thing. That's what we're called to be his followers. He goes on, but now, verse 21, but now, quite apart from Torah, God's way of making people righteous in his sight has been made clear, although the Torah and the prophets give their witness to it as well. And it is righteousness that comes from God through faithfulness of Yeshua the Messiah to all who continue trusting them. So if we continue to trust Yeshua's sacrifice for us, we are made righteous. Once again, he reinforces that it's not our behavior that saves us, thank God. It's trusting in the faithfulness of Yeshua and in his demonstrated sacrificial atonement that makes us righteous. For he goes on to say, for it makes no difference whether one is a Jew or a Gentile. That sort of sounds conflicting. Since all have sinned and come short of earning God's praise. By God's grace, without earning it, all are granted the status of being considered righteous before him through the act redeeming us all from our enslavement to sin that was accomplished by Messiah Yeshua. His point is that God rescues people, Jews and Gentiles, exactly the same way through the sacrifice of the Messiah. Verse 25, God put Yeshua forth as a kapora, a covering for sin, through his faithfulness in respect to his bloody sacrificial death. This vindicated God's righteousness, because in his forbearance he has passed over the sins people committed in the past, and it vindicates his righteousness in the present age by showing that he is righteous himself, also the one who makes people righteous on the grounds of Yeshua's faithfulness. Again, he lays out the plan of salvation. It's all about what Yeshua did for us humans. So what room is there left for boasting? Not at all. What kind of Torah excludes the message of salvation? One that really focuses more on the legalist observance of rules rather than understand the essence of what the Torah is saying. He's rhetorically asking if the Torah of tradition is able to make people righteous. He says no. Only the Torah or instruction of truth makes people righteous, focusing on Messiah's sacrificial work. So he starts to conclude now in verse 29. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Isn't he also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, he is indeed the God of the Gentiles as well, because as you will admit, God is one. Therefore, he will consider righteous the circumcised on the ground of trusting, and the uncircumcised to the same ground of trusting. Does it follow that we abolish the Torah by this trusting? Heaven forbid. On the contrary, we confirm the Torah. So the practical application is this. We can learn to love God's Torah, whether we're Jewish or not, and I encourage us to learn the ways of God revealed in the Torah, but we must always remember that our salvation does not come from following the written Torah or any of the traditions of the people of God. We're called to follow the teachings of the Torah, and it's good to learn the traditions, but none of that will rescue us from salvation. So as he's beginning to start getting into his letter, and we're going to learn so many wonderful things in the rest of the book of Romans, we need to remember this thing. What advantage has the Jew? Do you remember that question from the beginning? What is the value of being circumcised? What did he say? Much in every way. Our congregation, friends, consists of both Jews and Gentiles, and as we study the book of Romans, we're going to start seeing how this unique relationship was given by God to bring blessings to our lives and many other people whom we come in contact with. So the answer to my question at the beginning, does being Jewish matter? Does being Jewish matter? Paul's answer would be much in every way. We're going to unpack that in the next few months. Please stand as we close.